Welcome, everyone. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco, and I'm a senior fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS. Today, I'm here to conduct an interview for our Big Data China project. This is an initiative that the Trustee Chair has with Stanford's Center on China's Economics and Institutions, where we try and bridge academia and the policymaking world. And today, I have the pleasure of having with us Professor Yasheng Huang, who is Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT Slogan School of Management. Professor Huang is the author of 11 books in Chinese and English, and 2 more books on the way as well, many academic papers. And for those who studied China's politics and economics, like I did, I'm sure you have read many of his books and articles over the years, so it's a real pleasure to have you here, Professor.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Well, this is the question I always ask all the scholars we engage with through Big Data China, because we worry about, about research and making academic research accessible. I also wonder about how you conduct research, right? And so you've been doing research on China's politics and the political economy for decades now. How has this changed over time? And of course, I'm thinking about tensions between the U.S. and China, zero COVID, the political environment in China, but also, new technologies and access to different things. And I will note that your latest book is, largely, a historical analysis and relies on historical data.
Yeah, so the change is in one way from easy to difficult. In terms of doing field research, it was quite easy before. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you could just go and you could, through your own connections or through the collaborators that you had in China, gain access to business people, officials, local officials, central government officials, very easy. That has basically become extremely difficult and almost impossible, right? So now, to do that kind of research, especially talking to officials and even business people, if you want to get their kind of honest opinion of what's going on, it's almost impossible now. In the other way, it's become easier in the sense that data are more available. Data not only in the sense of released data by the government or survey data. Now we have the ability to construct data sets, websites and documentary data. So increasingly, we are pivoting from the kind of on-the-ground research to this kind of a data approach for necessity, as well as data research gives you kind of different insights as compared with the field research. Ideally, the two should complement with each other. They should go together. But now, given the geopolitical situation, we just have to settle for data.
Yes. Well, and speaking about research and data and collecting data and field work, you were one of the authors of the landmark MIT report on engaging with China as a university. This was, a report that was widely read within academic fields, but also in the think tank world, and we looked at it very closely here. And so I was wondering, how is that going, right? Has the university adopted those recommendations, and how have things been playing out? And with the end of zero COVID, how has engagement with China at the university level sort of proceeded?
Yeah, so the report was written at the time when the U.S. government was actively targeting professors, many of them, but not exclusively, of Chinese ethnic backgrounds, targeting them for performing and doing standard routine academic research with Chinese colleagues or having connections in China. And I have to say that the report played a very important role in highlighting that issue and highlighting the importance of open science, fundamental research, and the need to continue to collaborate with our Chinese colleagues in this new geopolitical environment on critical issues such as climate change, public health, food safety, and a whole range of issues. But in our report, we also recognize that geopolitics has changed. There are extraordinarily complex issues between the U.S. and China: national security, human rights, economic competitiveness. So the report tries to chart a course where we can continue with the kind of productive research we have been doing with Chinese colleagues before, but being mindful of these difficulties and challenges. I think we're now in a stage where we're working on implementation. And one of the key components of that is to raise the awareness of faculty, of graduate students, of the university administrators about these complicated issues. And I think we are doing a fairly good job with the report like that. The report has been cited and has been emulated by other universities. And I think another purpose of the report is to send a message to the government that academia, and MIT in particular, is proactively thinking about this issue. And we don't want the heavy hand of the federal government to regulate academic research.
Well, that's great to hear because, obviously it was a big issue, and even on our website, Big Data China, we published some of the research that was done on the impact on actual academic output of these tensions. And of course, actually, one of the things that I heard repeatedly was that both professors and government wanted universities to take a more proactive stance on regulating itself on this front. So it's good to hear that the impressive report that you put out has had a positive effect. But let's move on to actual research and the research you've done. And your book, The Rise and the Fall of the East, which is your last book, and of course we'll talk a little more about your upcoming books, is, in political science, there's always the people lament that there's no big idea books anymore. And I would say this is a big idea book, right? It's a bold, it's sweeping, it covers hundreds of years in terms of history, and it makes some really interesting, it links very different issues and makes very interesting conclusions. And I wanted to bring up a sentence that really struck me in the book is, Chinese history is stacked against democracy. I thought this was a really striking sentence. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about it and what you mean by this and how it ties to the argument.
So one way we can think about democracy, the standard way is separation of power, election, press freedom, and all of that. Another way to think about democracy is that it has heterogeneity, diversity of views, diversity of party affiliations, and even diversity of personal choices in terms of gender, in terms of all these things at the personal level. Autocracy has the homogeneity, sometimes constructed, sometimes enforced, but a sharp difference between autocracy and democracy is the difference between that. I said that in the sense that Chinese history is all about homogeneity. And they are building institutions, they're building mental habits, they're building traditions that are designed or have the effect of enforcing homogeneity. And that makes adoption or migration to a democratic system more difficult. By saying that, I'm not arguing against democracy at all. All I'm saying is that it requires more efforts, more investments, more engagements to make sure that democracy can also develop and flourish in that environment. And in East Asia, we have successful examples of democracy: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So there's nothing about the culture in that region that says you cannot adopt democracy. What I'm trying to say in the book is that given how the culture is, given how the history is, it is unlikely that democracy is going to emerge organically and spontaneously. Therefore, it requires extra efforts and extra investments.
Yeah, and you make also this argument that this tension between heterogeneity and homogeneity within states also shapes the innovation and sort of the human capital within a country. Can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I talk about democracy and autocracy in terms of heterogeneity vis-a-vis homogeneity. But one thing, at least I have observed, is not just of China, but also of other countries, is that successful economic development, successful technological development requires a balance between these two forces. You can't just have one at the expense of the other. I think China scaled too much, I would argue, and you could argue that there are other countries that scoped too much. And when you look at these countries, when they are most successful, they tend to be at the moment when they balance these two forces successfully. I would argue that between 1978 and 2018, China handled the balance of these two forces effectively and productively. And that's why the country had economic miracle, had a degree of technological and scientific achievements, had globalization, innovations, prosperity. And that was a rare moment in Chinese history because Chinese history tends to stack against that. It tends to go overboard on scale rather than on scope. And now my view is that China is moving back to its old formula of emphasizing scale at the expense of scope. And there's a view among Chinese policy elites. And by the way, this is not just Xi Jinping, it is actually a very pervasive view that Chinese success is a result of government power, is the result of the industrial policy, it is a result of the organizational capacity of the government to construct big projects, to scale technologies, to launch big projects. I'm not saying that's completely wrong. All I'm saying is that that took place in the middle of evolving diversity of economic conditions, political conditions, and social conditions. That's not a single factor driving the success. It is also the diversity that was driving the success.
Well, that really resonates with me because I have spent a lot of time the past few years looking at industrial policy in the context of clean tech supply chains. And in many cases, these are very creative, innovative private companies. It's just that they've received an extra boost by the government, right? And so I think that's sometimes not even well understood outside of China. I think increasingly in the U.S. maybe there's this sense that these are sort of engineered companies that the government sort of decided to create, and that's just not the case, right? Certainly there's been pervasive subsidies and help on the part of the government, but you needed this other ingredient, which was sort of company entrepreneurship and global supply chains eventually.
So there's already diversity embedded in your observation. These are private sector companies. I cannot name a successful globally competitive state-owned enterprise. That enterprise can have all the support it wants to, and the government wants to lavish on such an enterprise. But because it's state-owned, it has not been successful. TikTok is not state-owned, right? In the traditional sense. BYD is not state-owned. Huawei is not state-owned. Government operations now influence these companies for sure, but in terms of ownership, they're private ownership.
Right, and I think that raises the question for policymakers outside of China, the fact that now there is this creeping sort of influence or blurring of the lines between exactly what is private and what is public makes it a little harder to then sort of decide how to consider these companies as they become multinationals,
correct,
right?
Correct.
It's, in some ways, it may not be to the benefit of these companies that there are such blurred lines within Chinese corporate ownership.
I agree with that. I actually think that these subsidies and the government support today are doing more harm to these companies then they were doing benefits, then benefiting these companies. I believe that the competitiveness of these companies is sufficient enough to propel them to the global stage. And the subsidies are an extra push, but I don't think without those subsidies, those will be total failures.
Yes, and maybe the ones that wouldn't succeed would be the companies with the less attractive or good products, right? Yes, I completely agree with that. And I mean, let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your next upcoming book, which is an update on your previous book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, and the new book will be called Statism with Chinese Characteristics, correct? So I was wondering, I think the topic will be this, right? The sort of statism in China and opening and reform. Is opening and reform over?
In a very real sense, yes. The way I define the open era, the reform era, is that it was a movement moving from Mao Zedong. It was an official act to move away from the era of Mao Zedong. And Deng Xiaoping engineered that shift in 1978. If you go back to 1978 and read the party document on Cultural Revolution on Mao Zedong, it was a very honest and straightforward critique of Mao. So it was an official act to move away from Mao Zedong. One of the things that happened in 2018 was the revision of the Chinese Constitution that got rid of the term limits, mandatory retirement age instituted by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping instituted those changes specifically to move away from the Mao Zedong era. So the way I define the reform era is from 1978, when the Chinese Communist Party officially moved itself away from Mao Zedong, and then 2018, when officially the Chinese Communist Party decided to go back to the live tenure of the Mao Zedong era. That doesn't mean to say that economically speaking, China now is exactly the same as China in 1976. Clearly, there are some substantial differences. But I define the reform era first and foremost as a political act. In that sense, reform era is over.
And, actually picking up on that, you've argued that politics have shaped economics very deeply in China, right? You've sort of, I would say, rejected the idea that you have these economic reforms in a vacuum with no political reform in China. And that Tiananmen has been really a watershed moment in Chinese history. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's the key argument both in my 2008 book as well as in my forthcoming revised version of that book. But in this version, I make it even more clear that the pivotal moment was 1989. And the biggest change was politics. Economic changes, there were also economic changes, especially in rural China, but there were also economic reforms in the urban area that to some extent compensated for the reversions of the reforms in the rural area. So it came out as a wash. So you don't really observe that change very, very clearly. But because of the political changes, these political changes that the leaders instituted after 1989 laid down the foundation for future political changes in a way that were quite damaging to economic reforms. In particular, the changes that Zhao Ziyang proposed in the 1980s to separate the functions of the party from the state, to separate the political management of the government from the economic management of the government, transparency reforms, a degree of media freedom, and depoliticization of the Chinese bureaucracy. All these reforms were reversed immediately after 1989. So those were Zhao Ziyang reforms. What I argue in the book is that once you weakened or reversed these Zhaoziyan reforms, you exposed Deng Xiaoping, right? So the bigger reforms introduced by Deng Xiaoping, term limits, mandatory retirement, and government objective should be about economic development. So these are the three biggest things that Deng Xiaoping introduced as political changes. You expose these three changes to an act by a future strong leader. And that's exactly what has happened since 2018.
And so what is this new era?
Well, I think this era is going to be this tension between economics and politics. Chinese economy moved away from central planning, from socialism, far away enough so that reversing them will not be something very easy, unlike politics, right? So if the leaders after 1989 didn't reverse Zhaoziyan reforms, it would be much more difficult for them to reverse Deng Xiaoping reforms in 2018. But economics, that's more difficult because it's more distributed, because of the global connections, and also, very importantly, because Chinese economy, in a very strange way, is extremely dependent on Western rich countries. I mean, we can talk about Russia, we can talk about global South all the way we want. The simple fact is that the biggest customer, the richest customer, and the customer that observes contracts and sales contracts is the Western countries, right? And China now has created this situation in which the final demand is weak, but the production capacity is incredible, right? Overcapacity, the issue that Washington now is talking to Beijing about, right? That kind of situation forces China to be more dependent on the West. So we are seeing this kind of a curious situation in which politics and economics are moving in the opposite direction. Geopolitics, China is moving closer to Russia. Economically speaking, China is actually still quite dependent on the U.S. in terms of product market, to a lesser extent factor market. But technology, I think we're going to see technology, whether or not China is still quite dependent on the U.S. I believe it is, although Chinese leaders would disagree, right? But economically speaking, China is still quite dependent on the West. But politically, it is moving opposite from that. So within China, you are also going to see these tensions. The current government talks about big projects, industrial policy, science, semiconductor, big city developments, infrastructure. Okay, you can talk about these things all the way you want. These things require resources. Who is going to generate resources? It's going to be the private sector, right? So there are tensions domestically between the political policy of cracking down on private sector and the financial and economic dependency on the private sector. These are the tensions that didn't exist before Xi Jinping. And now these tensions are coming to the forefront of the Chinese economy, forefront of the Chinese politics. They really have to resolve these tensions. Either they just go all the way to crack down on private sector, then forget about these big things you want to do, or they have to revise their private sector policy to accommodate these big expenditure requirements.
And I think this framework is actually quite helpful in understanding some of the inconsistencies in policymaking in China today, where you see this big push to attract foreign capital, and at the same time, the security state continues to expand, and you have actions that are actually quite threatening to foreign companies. And the same goes for private Chinese companies as well. Right. And you actually see all these Chinese companies that are setting up, headquarters in Singapore, for example, which I think certainly is a reaction to de-risking in the West, but I think potentially also a de-risking from China themselves, right? But I wanted to talk a little, I was hoping this was going to be the one conversation today where we didn't talk about overcapacity, but it seems like it's unescapable as a topic. But I think it actually ties into something else I wanted to ask you about, which you've written about over the years, and I think continues to be important, which is the sharp inequality between rural and urban living standards, and also economic policy, which you've argued are sort of a feature rather than a bug in the Chinese system. Can you talk a little bit about how that ties into consumption imbalances and inequality and et cetera?
Yeah, so currently in Washington, the policy discussion is on EVs and solars. Overcapacity is actually a macroeconomic concept, not a microeconomic concept. The bigger issue for Chinese economy is this macroeconomic imbalance between supply side and the demand side. For a continental economy the size of China, second GDP in the world, the largest country in the world in terms of population, it is actually not so obvious it should be so dependent on overseas market in the first place, right? The GDP has been growing 8-9% a year for 30 years, and in the last 10 years it's growing 6%, but still that's pretty fast. So think about all these elements together, right? Fast GDP growth, big population, big continental size, big GDP. One would think you would have this huge domestic consumption capacity to absorb the production that has been created, right? And it shouldn't be so dependent on the rest of the world. And in fact, one of the arguments for the rise of China is that the rise of China is going to bring about this huge demand for goods coming from other countries, right? From America, from Europe, and from other countries. That has not happened. Chinese economy, the way that the Chinese economic strategy is geared toward the production side, supply side of the economy, rather than to the final demand side. And the fundamental reason for that, there are many reasons, but let me just name one, is that the rural Chinese are essentially the missing picture here. The whole property boom and much of the GDP growth did not benefit proportionally the rural Chinese. Even today, by the hukou standard, the rural Chinese still constitute 60% of the population. By residency standard, it is constituting about 40% of the population. If 40 to 60% of the population are now gaining as much from 8% GDP growth rate, 10% of the GDP growth rate, and from this massive property boom, then they're going to lose that purchasing power from a significant portion of the population, right? So that's actually the fundamental problem with the Chinese economy today. It is not narrowly about subsidizing EVs and subsidizing solars. It has fundamentally to do with factor market. The land reforms are not happening, and the hukou reforms are not happening. The labor market reforms are designed to benefit the capital at the expense of the labor. And Scott Rozelle wrote this, together with Natalie Hell, wrote this excellent book about lack of investments in rural China in terms of education and public health. Those are actually the fundamental reasons driving up Chinese over-dependency. And I don't see any evidence of, first of all, even awareness of that problem among Chinese policymakers, and let alone any concrete step to deal with that situation.
And I'll note that we had both an event and a feature highlighting the work of Scott Rozelle and in this area. One final question of this is, what would you think would be necessary to change this and fix this problem?
Yeah, so if you were
Xi Jinping.
Okay, so that's a big task. I would de-emphasize GDP. I would implement some of the reforms that have been happening experimentally at the local level. The hukou reforms were experimented in Chengdu, land reforms were experimented under Hu Jintao. So there was a blueprint, and they actually quite successful in terms of experiments. I will scale up and nationalize these reforms. You may not get an immediate bump of the GDP, but fundamentally what you care about is not the GDP growth per se. It is the ability of the GDP growth to deliver tangible gains to the Chinese people. Land reforms, now I would argue land reforms and hukou reforms are 20 years later than they should be, but it's better than never. And if they implement these reforms, you don't necessarily get a big bump of the GDP growth. You probably have to sacrifice a few percentage points of GDP growth because those reforms are not going to give you bridges and airports and new cities that are in oversupply in any case, right? But those reforms are going to make sure that for each percentage point of the GDP growth, the rural Chinese are going to benefit more from the GDP growth. So even if you have 3 percentage points of GDP growth, 4 percentage points of the GDP growth, then you still benefit the Chinese people. So that will be the first thing I will do. The second thing I will do is I will scale down the operations of the Chinese government. Chinese government is actually extraordinarily expensive to operate. When the economy is growing at 8%, 9% a year, you don't notice how expensive the government sector is. When it is growing at 5%, 4%, you're going to notice how expensive the government operations are. And this is a perfect time to cut down on the size of the government in order to make sure that the households still get a decent returns on their labor, on their investments. Private sector still gets decent returns. And the third thing I will do is to repair the relationship with the West, right? So I will do these 3 things rather quickly.
Well, I think that's a great agenda, and we'll see if anybody in Beijing is listening to our program and find out if they decide to do anything. But I actually agree, and I actually been arguing that the best thing that China could do right now to solve some of these tensions on the trade front is to signal that they're willing to take into consideration or even look at the kinds of reforms that might be necessary, right? That might actually be the least painful approach rather than sort of trying to deal with specific overcapacity in one factory versus another, which I think is probably less, in the long term, but less useful.
So let me just add one observation to that, which is that I think the fundamental issue now between China and the U.S. is lack of trust. And the way to reestablish that trust is not really meeting with CEOs and those people. It's really to decentralize government operations, gave beneficial rights to the Chinese people, in addition to repairing relationship with the West. Once you show that you're willing to delegate your power, you're willing to give up some of your power, I think the trust will come back. Just as it did after Tiananmen, when China signaled that it was going to continue on economic reforms on some issue areas.
I agree with you. Unfortunately, I fear that's going to be politically very challenging. But let's hope that there's a pathway to improving trust again between the 2 countries. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, our website, Big Data China, has many features, events, and data and resources that help bridge the gap between academia and policymaking and the broader public. So continue to follow us on social media and online. Thank you.